I found an interesting letter I thought I'd read to you. It's first I found it in, in the Indian Affairs papers, and here's a copy of the letter. It's a letter written by John T. Sprague with a meeting he had with Chief Billy Bowlegs in 1847. Now, at first I was going to transcribe it. It's actually a pretty long. It's about 10 pages long, handwritten. But I found out that it's actually transcribed in Tequesta magazine, is transcribed by James Covington in a 1964 issue of Tequesta. So I actually have, if oh, can't see it very well because of the reflection. Um, so I'm actually going to read some of the transcribed part. Now, I'm not going to read the whole letter. I'll just read the interesting parts. What was going on, and let's put everything in perspective here. So, John T. Sprague uh, was an officer significant in Seminole War history, and his meeting at Charlotte Harbor in 1847 was the government's attempt to try to remove the Seminoles to Oklahoma. Of course, the talk failed, but had some interesting points. A little background is that John T. Sprague. Here he is from a portrait from one of his parlor cards. Um, he was the aide de camp for General uh, William Worth uh, in the latter part of the Second Seminole War. When Worth came to Florida in 1839, Sprague was his adjutant. And in fact, Sprague married Worth's daughter, I think Sarah, I think her name is. But so anyway, he had family connections not only to William Jenkins Worth, but I think his granddaughter married a relative of Major Dade. So, it was a small army back then. So he came to Fort King and, of course, was headquartered in St. Augustine or Fort Brooke, back and forth. Here's a picture of St. Francis Barracks from Florida memory from the 19th century. It says after the Civil War, I don't know, it looks maybe earlier. John T. Sprague, of course, he wrote the book, The Origin, Progress, and Conclusion of the Florida War, shortened to the Florida War in 1848. And so he has part of this talk in here, but he doesn't have the whole thing, in fact. So I'm going to read some interesting parts that he didn't include in the book. And here's a copy of the original book. Actually, I saw at a Florida antique book show, and the book on its side, underneath the other copy of the, I think, original, is the facsimile copy from 1964. And the Seminole War Foundation still reprints the Florida War book, so you can actually get your own copy. It's very interesting, lists all the casualties from the war. And Sprague was also famous for some of the illustrations he did in his book. Here's one he did of Fort King from 1839. It's about the only illustration we have of Fort King, which is kind of shocking because it is a major fort. Of course, this was the second version of Fort King. And he also did portraits of the different chiefs in Florida. Here's Abraham and Kawakachi. And so Sprague, he was in Florida at the end of the war. He stayed in Florida for a few more years with General Worth. And Worth left to go to the Southwest and was in the Mexico War. And Sprague, I think he kind of went back and forth because he's still in Florida here for the talk in 1847 when the Mexican War is going on. And of course, he was headquartered at St. Augustine again, St. Francis Barracks. Um, then, after the Civil War, he came back to Florida and he was in charge of Reconstruction. He was the highest ranking Union officer during Reconstruction. and in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau. So he played a significant part in the Florida War. Of course, the St. Francis Barracks today in St. Augustine on Marine Street. I'm very familiar with the place, been there several times, been inside, and you see the barracks here on the portrait. Uh, to the left of the barracks today is the cemetery there, and the cemetery has many individuals who died in the Florida War. In fact, it has John T. Sprague, his wife, and his mother-in-law, the wife of William Jenkins Worth, are buried in that cemetery, in the National Cemetery at St. Francis, kind of in the back. If I had you with me, I could take you to their graves. I'm very familiar with the place. So anyway, we're going to talk about his meeting with this character we know as Billy Bowlegs, probably one of the second famous Seminole War chiefs, Osceola being the most famous personality and war leader from the Second Seminole War. The next famous is Billy Bowlegs. And this, I think, a photograph from 1852. He was the first photographed Seminole war chief from the Seminole Wars, and probably the first photographed Seminole, period. And in fact, there's more photographs of him than any other war chief of the same time. He was very well known, many illustrations in the newspaper. So you'll see several images of him right now. Um, in The meeting was held at Charlotte Harbor at the Kennedy store. Of course, if you're not familiar with Southwest Florida, Charlotte Harbor, it's about halfway between Tampa and Marco Island, or the start of the Florida 10,000 Islands. It's kind of, I guess, kind of the second largest harbor inlet, and the one of the biggest state parks here, Charlotte Harbor Preserve State Park. It's actually a very large park and includes over 100 Aboriginal shell mounds and site file sites. So it's very important historical as well. So anyway, they were meeting at the Kennedy store in Charlotte Harbor. Now if you know Paynes Creek State Park, also had the Kennedy Darling store. Well, Kennedy, who had his store in this area, uh, went down and started the store at Paynes Creek. So this image is actually from the Paynes Creek reenactment about a dozen years ago. So here's another image of Billy Bowlegs and the Chiefs when they were sketched for Harper's Weekly in 1858. So let's start out with the letter here. Captain Sprague with some of the Seminole leaders. He writes from the Kennedy's Trading House, Charlotte Harbor, Indian Nation, head of Pine Key, mainland Florida. So I guess Pine Key, that's Pine Island, I guess. January 11th, 1847. I have the honor to report that I met the Indians as anticipated at this place on the 8th instant. The chiefs Halati Miko, Billy Bowlegs, and Asinawar, Icho Amathla Chupko, which is Chupko, famous Seminole chief after the Third Seminole War. Chidohajo, Nubkapajo, sub-chiefs together with 34 young warriors, well armed without women and children were present, so they're being very cautious. I was disappointed in not meeting Abiaka or Sam Jones, who sent a messenger stating from age, indisposition, and the extreme cold weather, he was unable to travel. My insisting upon seeing him tended to disparage the position and power of Halati Miko, who in all respects is qualified for supreme command, which he exercises with skill and judgment. He was well respected by the whites as well. He is about 35 years of age, speaks English fluently, active, intelligent, and brave. Arpika is 92 years of age. So if that's his age at the time, Abiaka would be born about, are they saying maybe uh, 1855, which sounds about right from some of my other guesses. Without Abiaka is 92 years of age, without warriors, authority, or influence. These chiefs, their followers, express the strongest friendship and have adopted vigorous laws to punish those who violate the relation existing between the whites and the red men. But the young men, long accustomed to hunt the whites as they now do deer and turkey, are ruthless, vicious, and vengeful. To counter this, I have enjoyed the necessity and prompt and severe punishments and shall see that they are executed. The Indians are timid and cautious. They came into my camp prepared to receive kindness and extend it, evidently determined to avenge on the spot any manifestations of a contrary feeling. And so I'll skip ahead a few pages here. And Sprague, he's understands from their demeanor that they're not interested in talking removal there. The Indians increase in number as well as improve in condition owing to partial intercourse with civilization. Their scattered condition, isolated camps, and limited number constitute their strength. 120 men are capable of taking field, so 120 men are able to pick up arms. It says for the count of warriors, Seminoles 70, Miccosukee 30, Creeks 12, Yuchi 4, and Choctaws 4. Total 120 warriors. From observations and inquiry, I find 70 of this number grown from boyhood to manhood since December 1835, the commencement of the Florida War. The remainder, excepting Sam Jones and Sinawar, the former 92 and the latter 60, are not over 40 years of age. So most of them are young men. The women and children average about two to a man, making 250 of this number. 150 are children, thus making the total Indians of Florida men 120, women 100, children 140, total 360. And so he goes on to describe the climate and some of the living conditions. Skip over a few pages here. It's an interesting observation here. It says Spaniards fishing upon the coast have informed them that our troops in Texas have been whipped and driven home by the Mexicans and the Indians. So the Billy Bowlegs' warriors have heard from these Spanish fishermen that the Americans have actually been defeated, which is not the case. The Mexican-American War is going on right now, and actually the Americans are winning pretty thoroughly because of the advanced technology of the American artillery mainly. My recent interview with Indians will have tendency to allay an excitement and apprehension so necessary in all respects of the government to the citizens of the state and to the Indians. I've communicated freely and fully with Captain Winder, commanding Fort Brooke, asking for Indians, should any visit his post, kindness and attention. At the same time, representing the necessity of vigilance to thwart the design of those loungers upon the border, too lazy to work or steal, but abandoned enough to thrive upon the honest gain of others, whom they hoped to defraud by tracts, signs, and hostilities, thus securing to themselves the plunder and probable good luck of being murdered into service at a few dollars a month. And so skip down a little more. And this is interesting here, more interaction between Billy Bowlegs and some of the men he finds on the coast. In the Mexican War, you may have, if you're familiar with that history, there's the San Patricio Battalion, which was the Irish regiment in the American Army who deserted and actually went and fought with the Mexicans. They were defeated at one point, and the American Army court-martialed and hanged several of them. Um, so I think this might be referring to some of that when it refers to some Americans that joined the Mexicans. Holader Miko, Billy Bowlegs, informs me that at Charlotte Harbor in November last, he met two white men who landed in a small boat, accompanied by four sailors in a row. They had in their hands paper and pencil and a compass. Their vessel, they said, was outside at sea. These men informed him that two officers of the United States Army had joined the English who were participating with the Mexicans and Indians in driving the American soldiers out of Mexico. This he told me that I might explain it to as the statement was crude and unsatisfactory to him as his narration and particulars were to me. So Billy Bowlegs apparently didn't believe them. What he states, I am convinced is true, which to my mind is common with many trifling circumstances, coming to my knowledge in association with fishermen, Spaniards, Indians, and Americans on the coast keys, in shadowing forth and coming events. This chief has been since the commencement of the Florida War a bold, resolute, unyielding leader. He is ambitious and cunning, remarkably intelligent, speaking English with faculty. His excessive vanity excites these qualities, priding himself on his power as a chief and maintenance of that supremacy belonging to and ascending to his ancestors. His mother was the sister of King Payne and Old Bowlegs, who up to the year 1815 commanded the Indians in Florida, well known to all whites for an intelligence and bravery. If I can comment him, I was talking to Bill Steele a few months ago that Bill Steele had found that John Casey had written that Billy Bowlegs was considered the heir or son of King Payne, and how it works in the Seminole Miccosukee culture. It's a matriarchal matrilineal culture. Is that it's confirmed here in this letter when it says he's the son of the sister of King Payne. So that would put him next in line as chief of the Seminole Nation. But at the time, as John Casey said, Billy Bowlegs was too young to take up the chiefdom, and so it went to Micanopy instead. And Bowlegs, he had died soon after, around 1815. That was Bowlegs the first, and Billy Bowlegs here we kind of know as Billy Bowlegs the second, and then there's a Billy Bowlegs the third, no relation either to these in the early 1900s. He died in 1964 and is buried in Ortona Cemetery near LaBelle. A little sidetrack here. And let me continue on the letter. With these particular qualifications and undisputed authority exercised in Florida was with an auxiliary force or alone, this Indian would be a most formidable foe, of course, as he was in the Third Seminole War. As a friend cherished by that which would contribute to his vanity, power, and independence, he could be relied upon to expel the intruders of whatever nation and became a faithful ally to those who secured his confidence with regard. And he was really in that point. Before the Third Seminole War started, he went to some of his friends among the white settlers and told them to get out of the area because he would not be able to protect him from some of the young warriors. And of course, the United States kind of got ended up screwing the deal by having the surveying party supposedly destroy his garden, which was one of the main reasons for the cause of the Third Seminole War, also known as the Billy Bowlegs War. Let me continue here. Back to 1847. I have endeavored to obtain this so far as in my power. Proper measures can cherish and perfect it, and this chief who with sufficient inducement be an active enemy no matter from whose hands received, can be made a friend and faithful friend to the government, which he was for a time. And let me go to the last paragraph. The first step in my judgment is to obtain beyond the influence and friendship of Halater Miko. He should see our numbers and the power of the country, visit Arkansas with the hope he might with his band emigrate to avoid collusions, then add to his authority and position by making him independent in means, thus securing control over the Seminole Nation should he emigrate. If not the subject, an organization of the number in Florida would aid very materially in the defense of the frontiers of the state by land and by water. These considerations have induced me to invite him as sub-chiefs to visit Washington and Arkansas, understanding that I must first obtain authority. I have your honor to be respectfully your obedient servant, John T. Sprague, Captain, U.S. Army, in charge of Indian Affairs in Florida, to General Roger Jones, Adjutant General in Washington, D.C. And of course, he also forwarded to the uh, officer in charge of Indian Affairs, the Office of Indian Affairs. I think his name was William Medill. Anyway, this picture, last picture here by famous German artist Karl Wimmer, is a painting done by Billy Bowlegs and his son, which I think might actually been done near the end of Billy Bowlegs' life. Uh, what we know from history in the Third Seminole War, after the Americans kind of spoiled the deal and Billy Bowlegs and his warriors went to war, eventually the United States pressured them after pretty much chasing them unrelentingly and starving them out to agree to move the West. So Billy Bowlegs and 180 of his men, women, and children of his band moved west, left Tampa Bay on May 8th, 1838, went to New Orleans, stopped over there, and that's where I think the lithograph of the chief saying down, there's also a daguerreotype of that image. And from there, they went to Indian Territory or Oklahoma. Billy Bowlegs soon died out there. He uh, died at the house of John Jumper, according to the newspapers, in early 1859, soon after arriving. Apparently, his brother carried on the leadership, and apparently the name too as well, who's buried in Fort Gibson National Cemetery under a gravestone, Billy Bowlegs. So there's some confusion when he died and where he was buried, but that's an interesting. But probably the second most famous war leader of the Second Seminole War behind Osceola was Billy Bowlegs. Of course, there's many chiefs. And I hope you enjoyed this interesting letter from 1847 with some interesting observations. And I'll talk to you later.